Let's just do it. Well, usually we kick these off with Nevitt, being like,
No,
okay.
No, I ask an opening question mostly as a matter of form to get the discussion kicked off. But if somebody else has something, a burning question or comment or something, I'm fine with that.
I kind of opened with that just because, like, yeah, I agree. I mean, I've or at least like, yeah, I've known that I've noticed and taken note of the fact that your intro questions usually aren't just like, like a mandatory, procedure or right, but that it's like in order to just open up with a basic general beginning simple question.
So did you ask a question, Hunter?
No, but I have a lot. But if you want to start with one,
well,
I
let's talk about attributes. Thinking of questions,
Sure.
What do we think about this aspect of attribute and thought? Because it almost seems to me like he's saying that like an attribute is a way of seeing a thought in a different way. It's kind of weird. Like he seems to be combating Descartes' intersectionalism between mind and body by seeming to say that there's this kind of, like, as we were saying before this recorded, almost parallelism between mind and body when they interact, and that a thought has an attribute and an attribute is associated with a thought. So what do you guys think about that? That was my best Jackson impression I could do.
Just to clarify, thought and extension are both attributes themselves, right?
Well, the way he seems to make it in a category of thought, thinking, extension, and extended substance. Like he thinks a thinking substance is God, an extended substance is God, but then thought is a thinking substance, and extension seems to be an extended substance. So it's almost like he's getting around the aspect of like, okay, the mind and body aren't really separated because the mind is part of the substance and it interacts with the object, which has an attribute. So he seems to be like putting attributes on things to say that they're more connected rather than separated, like how Descartes thought mind and body were really simple, or Plato thought that the mind was really simple and the soul was simple for Plato, excuse me, and that the mind was very complex. He seems to be merging the two together almost. So what did you guys view as an attribute, and how did
I actually have Nevitt, you go if you want, because
I was just gonna I just reiterate what I said in the chat, that my understanding from what Chase said is we only experience two attributes, thought and extension. And then last time Chase also emphasized that, well, what he says there it's one substance, but they're expressed through these two different attributes, which are the only ones that we have experience of. Is that correct, Chase?
Yeah, so technically substance, there's only one substance. There's no numerical distinction in substance. That comes way later with the modes. So it's one substance. He'll refer to, it's a little confusing because he refers to, a thinking substance or a corporeal substance, and it makes it seem almost like they're different substances, but that indeed is not the case. It's all one substance. But even one is a little tricky because that number is an abstraction. So it's really almost like, like, I don't want to get all new agey here, but it's almost like a non-dual kind of thing where it's just simply, there's no distinction within it, numerical distinction, but it's a single thing. Okay. And yeah, so it expresses itself in infinite attributes. Thought and extension are the two that we know because we are constituted by those attributes. Because
how would you define extension?
Sorry, what was it?
How would you define extension?
Oh, so
how would you say he defines extension?
Yeah, so extension, I see that as just kind of, it's extended space. It's a little more complex than that, but I think the best way to understand it is kind of almost in the most literal way of this is kind of the extension, the space that we have here, the way that things fill out space, almost like a container, even though it's a little more complex than that. But I think that that's generally what he has in mind. Yeah, that's going to be that extension. But you can see this is also, so the individual things, the extended things are bodies, which is, I think, probably the best way to understand what exactly he's talking about. So yeah,
all modes are expressions of extension, right?
So modes are they're expressions, but also affections of attributes, but they have a kind of a, they also have there's kind of like a double relation of expression where they also express substance as a modification of substance, mode modification. If you think of the way that those two words are very similar, that's one kind of relation of expression right there. But then it's like, okay, well, what's going on with the attributes? They also are this modification of an attribute. So a mode is going to be, there's kind of an order of these things. That's how he talks of them as a, what is the parallel relation? He first describes it as in order, an order, or a kind of is like an order of connection. It's like that correspondence. But okay, what is this order? I think it's the order of expression or production of God doing it himself, but that's what leads to these modes. And the order is something like substance, attribute, mode. So the attribute is an expression of substance's essence, which is like a quality, an infinite quality. In the way you think of extension as this infinite thing that we can infinitely modify in some aspect, a qualified infinity, definitely, but it can be like taken to an absolute in some sense. And the same thing with thought. But the thing is, though, they can be conceived within themselves, so they don't need a reference to another attribute. So that's how he kind of determines that they can be formally distinct from each other, which is also real distinction. And so from that, okay, you've got the attributes, these qualities, they're formally distinct, but they express the essence of substance. And then what happens with that? You get an affection of an attribute, a quality, and that gives you an individual finite thing, and that's going to be a mode. So a mode is going to be of an attribute, and it's going to depend on an attribute and refer to it. Or not refer, scratch that word. But yeah, so Spinoza is not an emanationist, but if you know kind of, the cool diagrams of all the Neoplatonists where they have, the one God, and then, how from the one do we get the multiple? It's like this flowing down of multiplicity from the one. So he's not an emanationist. But I think that's a helpful way to initially kind of get a hint of how there is that order of production kind of going on from one thing. The difference is that it doesn't produce the multiple outside of it, but imminently in it. Hopefully that Did that just confuse things further? I'm sure that opened like a ton of questions in itself. But yeah.
Let me just ask one clarifying question, and I'm going to kind of ask the same thing in reverse order, but hopefully it'll kind of funnel us. Can there be a physical object mode, a mode of substance that would be like this book is as a mode of substance that is without extension?
No.
Right. They would all have to be either thoughts or one of the ones that are unknowable to us.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Oh God.
Wait. So I put in the chat, but my impression, mode can apply to the attribute of thought, yes or no?
Yes.
So there can be a mode that's not extended? Question mark.
Yeah, but not like a body of substance like this book, right? Like we could have like love and hate and all of those things could be modes of thought. But I'm just trying to make sure there is no object, body that is without extension, just to make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the book is a mode of extension.
Okay.
Wait, but okay, are all, at least according to, as far like, and this, apologies if this seems like sort of like an implicit criticism, but it's like later on he talks about like on page on proposition 11 and proposition 12, P11 and P12. This is my, if no body can exist without extension, but modes of thought like love and stuff aren't extended. Is that what? That's pretty, it makes sense, right? Or are love and stuff extended? No, those aren't extended. Okay, maybe whatever. Let's just say that I've got it right, and it makes basic intuitive sense, right? Love doesn't take up space, does it? I don't know. He says in P11, the first thing which constitutes the actual being of a human mind is nothing but the idea of a singular thing which actually exists, blah, blah, blah. He goes on in the demonstration corollary in scholium of P11 to say that it follows that the human mind is a part of the infinite intellect of God, right? Okay, right. We're with him so far. I was like, all right, sure. But then he says, okay, so therefore, when we say that the human mind perceives this or that, we're saying nothing but that God, not insofar as he's infinite, but insofar as he's explained to the nature of the human mind, or insofar as he constitutes the essence of the human mind, has this or that idea. And when we say that God has this or that idea, not only insofar as he constitutes the nature of the human mind, but insofar as he has the idea of another thing together with the human mind, that we say that the human mind perceives the only thing partially or not adequately. This was crazy, and he knew that it was crazy when he said in the scholium, he was like, I know that was some pretty crazy stuff I just dropped, and you're probably wigged out right now, but bear with me. I promise we're gonna get somewhere cool. It sounds crazy, but just bear with me. And then P12, I was like, you're fine. Like this is totally out there. This guy's like 17th century, but like for me, like just crazy space age. When he says like, okay, whatever happens in the object of the mind constituting the human, in the object of the idea constituting the human mind must be perceived by the human mind, or there will necessarily be an idea of that thing in the mind. That is, if the object of the idea constituting a human mind is a body, nothing can happen in that body which is not perceived by the mind. Say what? Okay, the reason that's so wacky and wild is it opens this question. So like the human mind is a part of God's infinite. This is all getting back to that question of things with extension. Because like if we say like, okay, all bodies have extension, right? We can at least agree on that. But like what we're questioning, at least lightly suggesting the questionability of what is extension. Because it seems like what he's saying is that nothing happens to bodies unless perceived by the mind, by the divine mind. That all things are, in a sense, then, insofar as anything happens to them, which stuff happens all the time, unless I'm wildly misunderstanding, all things are ideas in the mind of God.
So, and he does too on the next page say all of which, though in different degrees, are nevertheless animate. So he talks about like all bodies, all things being animate. I think he kind of makes that same claim of saying that there is some like idea or like element of thought associated with like all bodies. I mean, that was my reading of it too. That, you know, I guess that idea when he speaks to, like, there's two, like, you know, I put in the chat, like there's causal lines. He says it somewhere in this section where he's talking about like thought can only like refer to thought. It doesn't have to refer to the other attribute to like explain what's happening. But nevertheless, like there is something happening in extension that's like correspondent to thought, but not necessarily causing it. And I guess he's saying that same thing about humans and their bodies, but also like a rock. But you know, he says to different degrees, right? And I think that's almost like the disclaimer, the cop out. But yeah, somebody said panpsychism in the chat, and that's kind of how I read it too.
Yeah, because it almost seems like he's saying that like mind and body are two ways of talking about one and the same thing. So it's less about what is said and how it is said when it comes to mind and body, because and that they're all kind of interconnected together, and that there's this aspect of God that isn't human centric and teleological. It's actually a part of nature.
I don't know if I would say interconnected as much as mirrored. Like I think it's easy to see like these. It's like classic. I'm just going to lean on classic parallelism for a second here, but there are two tracks that, for whatever reason, Spinoza has plenty of justification for why he believes it to be this way, but are running alongside each other, but are nevertheless like distinct things. And I think Spinoza seems to me, at least, to make the case that like these are very much so different things. They just so happen to, for all of the justification he gives in this chapter, correspond to one another in a way that you can bounce between the two, to where the body has a correspondence in thought, and thought, body, etc., or mode or substance, or however you want to put the other part.
Like there's no difference between mechanism and intelligent action for him.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they'd all be causal. Yeah, they'd all be causal effects. Yeah. Like the same root push at the end of the day.
What you just said is interesting, because I feel like it begs the question of like, how will Spinoza think of like intelligent action, or what was the phrase you used? Because I don't think he associates like power and freedom with like a will. Like I think the will is kind of removed out of the equation. Like I don't know if there's like a free will kind of behind thought or behind God's intellect.
He seems to be a hard determinist from this, like super hard determinism. Like there's nothing free about your existence whatsoever. You're just playing out God's little thought experiment, basically.
But I guess I also don't see it as like that carries all the way up to substance too. And that like it's not necessarily like God's free thought experiment. But I think God
it's not, yeah,
like operating from his own nature.
Like out of necessity, like how God must, I guess, would be one way to put it. That's probably sloppy language. I don't know. Sorry.
I'm not even sure. I mean, we're talking as if God is a person who does stuff, and I'm not even sure that's the case. So to say, like I was saying in the chat, what does it mean to say that God acts or that God thinks? It seems like we're again, thinking of this notion of there's this God and then there's the world, and God is thinking, and like the prime mover or something, or like the Christian God, God is over here doing and thinking stuff and making stuff happen in the world. But I don't think that's the way it is for Spinoza. So
I think that's why I was trying to say, by taking the will out of the picture of like when we use this word God.
It's a single substance. It's not man-centric. It's not anthropomorphic God.
And I don't know how accurate this is, but a podcast I was listening to referenced in Latin the word that they're using for substance. He made this argument that it is related a little bit more to like activity, right? Like not like a thing, but like a process. And I don't know how I feel like I find that attractive just because, you know, I lean towards these kind of like process philosophies, but I wonder what the kind of word that's being used to refer to substance and kind of how that plugs into.
Yeah.
But
so
like
I'm gonna-
passive and active, that's just to think about what Joey's saying before. Like he seems to think that this substance has a passive and active quality with attributes, like and where we have that mode of interaction, like the single substance God in thought. There's some things that are active, and then there's some things that are passive that we just kind of have interact with. But all of them are extensions of you know, interacting between mind and body, interacting with different forms of attributes.
Yeah, so substance is going to be just active, and that, which is kind of the same thing as being free, according to his definition, which is kind of self-determining your necessity, which that's what substance does. So, wait, is that right? That thing is called free, which
Got a cheat
exists
sheet?
solely by the necessity of its own nature, and of which the action is determined by itself alone. So that's free. So, and I think he's saying that we can get there in the end, but indeed, as he says, continue on with me slowly, step by step, and to make no judgment on these matters until they have read through them all, referring to us dear readers. So we need to read the entire book before we make any judgments. And that sounds like a command that he's giving too. So
Hear that, undergrads?
but yeah, so Joey, what you're saying about the Latin and the Greek words, so the Latin substance or substantia, so that has this, you know, looking at the etymology of it, it seems standing underneath. It has a very kind of staticky kind of connotation to it, which I don't think that's totally off base with what Spinoza's thinking of substances, but that's supposed to be that's a Latin translation of a Greek word, which I think is ousia, which is something like that's a active participle, I believe, or present participle, which would be something like so in English we use like an ing at the end of something. So instead of, you know, think, it's thinking would be something like that. So I think, but for referring to being though, so it's kind of like an active being is the idea of ousia in Greek, and that substance is supposed to be kind of a translation of that. So, which I think, yeah, that works definitely with the sense that there's that active aspect of it. It's active power, but it is static to a certain degree also. Maybe static's not the right word. Should probably stick with what he says. But yeah. God is organism.
It's P3. P3 is
Whitehead.
like this is where the panpsychism came out for me. Was P? Sorry, did I put the wrong one on there? I think I said P3, but I think it's actually P5. Sorry. The formal being of ideas admits God as a cause only insofar as he is considered as a thinking thing. It's like, I understand humans are supposed to be like these little like nodes of thinking in the greater construct that is the thinking thing of God. So it almost like when you look at it like that, there's this conversation going around as far as like, how do we is God being anthropomorphized or de-anthropomorphized in any meaningful way? And as much as I earlier, was totally fine with God being synonymously used with something like the universe, it seems to be the case here that if you were to try to sell me on the idea that God as a thinking thing implies something more than the dead space science may otherwise think of as the universe, right? I think I would buy into that just based off of Spinoza's own words. God as organism is far. That's a far statement, but maybe you've heard someone say this before, like the universe is a living, breathing thing. That almost seems to be what's trying to be conveyed in calling him a thinking thing, but not to that level of extreme. I want to make sure that's clear.
Yeah, so that's like hylozoism. So I kind of I did the reading schedule, and when I did it, I set it where I didn't want to go into he has this kind of not digression, I mean it's relevant, where he goes into these are what bodies are. That's what we'll read next time. So I wanted to cut off before then, but really I should have cut it off when he actually goes into that section and have us read P13, because I think that's pretty relevant to the whole trying to articulate the parallelism and whatnot. And that's where the panpsychism, hylozoism, whatever you want to call it, I think is quite explicit. And then he says that basically all the things I've talked about up to now have been general and that they apply to everything, and that everything is animate but in degrees, and that there's no difference in that regard between a human mind or body or whatever or anything, and then a non-human thing. So he's saying that he's going to go into trying to define the human mind and the human body. But see, okay, because the mind is the idea of the body, you first have to know what bodies are. So that's kind of the next step. So eventually he's trying to get there, because indeed we're humans reading this book, or at least on some level, maybe.
I think I read page 40. I don't know if everybody did. I thought that was where we were.
I read up to 40.
But
Yeah.
that last paragraph, he kind of says like, yeah, so what is the difference between human mind and the others? And he's like, how it surpasses them. I thought it was interesting kind of what he says there. He says, in proportion as a body is more capable than others of doing many things at once, or being acted on in many ways at once, so its mind is more capable than others of perceiving many things at once. In proportion as the actions of the body depend more on itself alone, or as other bodies concur with it less in acting, so its mind is more capable of understanding distinctly. And so that sentence I was reading as him like, that is not referring to the human. Like, to me, this idea of like bodies concurring with it less in acting, depending on itself alone, I was kind of like, I mean, is he saying that the human body has like more capacity to interact with things, and so it's actually going to have a more difficult time having a distinct understanding? ? And then the next question, or the next sentence, he's like, we can know that the excellence of one mind over the others. We can also see the cause why we have only a completely confused knowledge of our body, as if to say, like, our bodies are just so complex that it's natural that our minds are confused. I kind of just found that interesting, but it's reminding me of the kind of conversations on consciousness being something that's like trying to kind of withhold and inhibit all these inputs to try and make sense of things. And like, it's kind of like why we get, more, maybe from Spinoza's perspective, just a more kind of a wacky sense of consciousness, as he refers to it, as confused. But
because it's almost like he's almost saying that like the mental is almost unavailable to us, like there's this distinction between mind and body even having any possibility of interacting for Spinoza, because he seems to think that there's always going to be causal events that are interpreted through the physical. And if we try to, he acknowledges the distinction, but he seems to say the physical is always going to be interpreted through the physical, And when we try to use the mental, it's just going to impose a physical attribute into the mental. So it's almost like the body without organs. It's like he's saying that, like on 35, he says, from this it follows that the formal being of things which are not modes of thinking does not follow from the divine nature, because God has first known the things rather than the objects of ideas follow, and were informed from their attributes in the same way and by the same necessity at which we have shown ideas to follow from the attributes of thought. So 30, it's like he's saying we are always going to, there is a distinction between the mind and body, but the interaction is not possible. We're always going to have this mental state, but it's almost like he views the mental state like Deleuze views the body without organs. It's like the causality that we interpret from the attributes gives it a logical structure.
Yeah, I think that that's pretty good as a kind of description of how they're parallel, that they don't have that causal interaction between them, but they said they are kind of, it's kind of like a Mobius strip where you've got, one thing, Mobius strip, but you got two sides of it. And the same thing, you got one thing, but then two perspectives of it. So it's also, you think of those, so there's those images that portray, Gestalt figures where they're kind of complementary, that, it's one thing that you can look at it and perceive, is it an old woman or a young woman, and based off kind of, only at one time can you really look and see the perspective and that's there, but then you can switch over and see that there's also another kind of complementary perspective. Yeah, duck or rabbit. Yeah, same thing. Yeah. So yeah, that's and then there's something, I can't remember what I was gonna say. There's something Joseph, you said at the end that I think was another additional point. I can't remember though.
I'm not really understanding
The causal structure being a logical structure.
Oh yeah, so I think there's something like that where, and that's what he means
Sorry,
by
Joey,
having an order that they share. In order, so it's the causal order, and that also, so that's kind of what the correspondence is. So I mean, it's a little, there's something like a few parts to it, but when he's talking about it in what is it, Proposition 7, I believe, when he first introduces it. So he talks about it as order of nature equals connections of causes. Yeah, so connection of causes. So that is also what gives kind of this logical order to things as well. And there's also a kind of Deleuze refers to this as the spiritual automaton, which is basically an idea of like thought that is capable of just thinking on its own, kind of like a logic device of some type, where you just kind of like plug in something and it kind of does it on its own. So I think there's something like that where thought just as an attribute is going to follow that order of causes kind of all on its own like a robot, but then that's distinct from extension, which also has its own kind of physical laws, and that's and order of causes, which are a little different. But yeah, it's basically the same idea of they're distinct things, no causal interaction, they share that correspondence and that connection.
And that's interesting because I feel like when I was talking about the body thing, for me, it makes sense to say, oh, my mind is so complex because my body is complex, as if the kind of body takes priority. And I feel like that kind of just throws this like almost a wrench of just like, why? Like, why does thought develop on its own to this point? But I think, so a question I had, I have no idea what the mereological is, but that's not even my question. But the mental, when you're Joseph, when you're using the words characteristics of the mental are unavailable, I'm not understanding what that is. That are you referring to kind of like thought, as in like the thought extension distinction, or is mental something different? And then my question is like,
Wait.
is that correct? Are the mental not available to us?
Yeah, I viewed it as the mind and body have like a mind state, and the thoughts that we have are attributes that we attribute from body interactions. So there is kind of like a mental state, but it's just not accessible to us because everything that we determine, the structured order of everything that we've interacted with is done for our interpretation of causality. Like we can access attributes, but we can't take those attributes that we have determined from whatever system of interaction we have and apply it to a mental state.
So the way that, I mean, if the way that, at least that Spinoza is using the word attribute, if I understand what Chase is saying, strictly speaking, there's just mind and matter, or there's just thought and extension. So I'm not sure, how you're using the word attribute there. Or it may be in a sense different from what Spinoza is using them.
Yeah,
I was basing it on
maybe
page 35.
Mode.
I mean, that's the one I had read where he talks about attributes of interactions with bodies, like particularly he says rather the objects of ideas follow and are inferred from their attributes in the same way and by the same necessity is that which we have shown ideas to follow from the attributes of thought. He seems to be saying that we have causality in physical aspects that we interact with thought that we're trying to bring into a mental state, which is inaccessible to us.
My impression is that it's not necessarily inaccessible, but they just don't interact in ways that we might think. And my impression was that they're both accessible to us. Like we can look at the causality of bodies and we can look at the causality of thoughts.
Well, he seems to be saying that's not possible. Like we can only look at the causality of the objects we interact with. We're never really looking at a mental state or a thought. We're only looking at objects, attributes, and interactions. Because further down on 35, he says, namely that whatever can be perceived by an infinite intellect as constituting an essence of substance pertains to one substance only. And consequently that thinking substance and the extended substance are one and the same substance, which is now comprehended under this attribute, now under that. So he seems to be saying that there is a distinction between mind and body, but all we interact with is body.
My impression of that last little phrase, now comprehended under this and now under that, is that we do have the capacity to kind of like jump tracks.
Well, the thing that I took from that, that quotation that that Joseph read was that they're just, it doesn't seem to me like they're distinct. They're not ontologically distinct. I mean, they're different attributes of the one substance, but they're, like he said, they're the same thing viewed from two different perspectives. I don't really understand what that means, but I'm uncomfortable after having, maybe I'm wrong here, but again, I'm uncomfortable after having read that kind of thing that Joseph read, to be thinking of mind and body as these two different distinct things that you have to worry about how they interact with one another. It seems like he's trying to finesse that distinction by, this talk of them being these two attributes of the same substance viewed from these two different perspectives. And so I think he's trying to maybe avoid that hard distinction, and that requires us to, explain, as Hume said, how would a substance of so different a nature, substances of so different natures interact? And, his answer is, well, they're not ontologically different in that sense.
Well, I'm wondering if he's saying there's like a difference between this truth of our being that is certain, like ontological certainty and attributes, and only we can access our attributes. But I could be wrong too.
So I think God's, nature, the way that it produces with, eventually is the attribute of thought and extension that does kind of ground this in epistemological. I mean, he's giving an epistemology, and he's saying. So I think this is something where, us, whatever the hell we are, postmoderns, whatever the idea. It's so difficult for us to get, to knowledge, especially on a kind of ontological ground, without just simply being a kind of naive realist of some type, but I think for his time, he's thinking of something. Eric, you especially are totally a pomo neo-Marxist. Oh God, yeah, that's it. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, but yeah, so there's an epistemology thing kind of going on there, but then, and that's a big concern. I mean, consider, there's a connection with Descartes, even though, yeah, that Cartesian influence is dramatically overplayed, in my opinion. But still, that's the kind of background in which he's operating. And I think if you consider the kind of epistemology that's going on there with, Descartes in his pajamas, wondering if he's dreaming or not, where so Spinoza indeed wants to do something quite different on a epistemological level like that, especially in method. Like he's not going to, yeah. But what is going on there? I think Joseph, I think you have the kind of, what you have is kind of like this instinct in Spinoza to sense the kind of fleeting nature of true knowledge and whatnot, especially
Absolute knowing.
Yeah. I think, I think that the third kind of knowledge is essentially something like a kind of absolute knowing, although I don't even really know what the hell absolute knowing is, and so yeah, don't know what that is. Yeah, I'm clever. Okay, so the thing is, what's going on with this epistemology thing? I think there's definitely a level where he's going to say, yeah, we are encased in a lot of inadequate ideas caused by this constant interaction of things from the senses and whatnot, but so inadequate ideas doesn't mean they're false. It just means it's something we'll get there eventually, but we have a lot of kind of like partial truths. The problem is that we usually will consider something as we have some kind of an impression, and we'll think that, oh, that's from this object, when really it's describing the interaction of the object and also my own body kind of picking up and keeping the trace of that impression. So that's this kind of mixing that he's talking about.
I guess that's where I lean towards the parallelism doctrine that seems to be widely accepted for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's accurate. But then the thing, so you can though get out of this, because that's kind of the first level of knowledge. But that's the role of reason, is to give you this, you kind of select these different encounters, from these affects, things that happen to you, something interacts with your body, and by kind of going through this process of selecting distilling the things that happen to our body, we can start to have a better grasp of things, because bodies are also ideas at the same time. So it's the same way that your body is kind of confused in itself from a certain perspective. Same thing with our minds, because they're reflecting each other. So, but eventually it is all these things, even the most like ridiculous, inadequate ideas still has a kind of a grain of reality to it, even if it's a small one. Yeah. Oh, so okay. I guess nobody wanted to talk. So, Nevitt, to answer your question, the formal distinction, numerical distinction. So the formal distinction, that's the distinction between the attributes.
Between mind and or extension and thought.
Yeah. And that would, theoretically, that also corresponds to the infinity of attributes too. Even though we only know two. But yeah, and so formal distinction, that's a term, another one of these things that, so Deleuze, he gets that from Duns Scotus, but it's kind of a common scholastic thing, or so I've read. So, and Spinoza would have been familiar with that. So it's not a term he uses. He talks about real distinction though, and says that, which is another way that Duns Scotus also said real distinction is formal distinction. So just to like clarify, which I think it helps clarify, Deleuze calls that, okay, yeah, this is real distinction, or formal distinction refers to these attributes where they're distinct in a sense, but they refer to the same thing. So they're distinctions within the same subject, or the same object is denoted, but yet about two distinct things. So that's kind of what's a
like the order and connection of ideas is similar to the order and connection of things, but they're separate.
Yeah, they're autonomous series. Yeah. Or independent series. Yeah. And they're equal too, which is interesting because he's saying body is equal to mind, which is kind of a radical position at that time, because it kind of goes with the religious kind of milieu that good morality is the control of the mind over the body, like a ton of philosophers talk about, Plato, definitely, and Descartes, definitely. So that's what something he's challenging there. Yeah.
Because it almost seems, and I'm wondering if this is what he's trying to do with the ethics when he says on page 39, from this it follows that the human mind is part of the intellect of God, because he almost seems to think that the mental and the physical realm are identical with respects to causal structure, but separate. And we can't interpret the mental with causality, but there is a system that we can interact with that can provide us this like degree of absolute knowing that you're kind of referencing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And yeah, that's there is eventually an identity relation between those, but insofar as you're referring to as substance, and that insofar as is very important. That's always pay attention to insofar as, because the way he qualifies things Yeah, I think that's basically how Spinoza does his reasoning in a lot of ways. Yeah, there's an order of causal connection, correspondence, and then there's also ultimately an identity between those. And as far as their ontological substance is substance. Hunter seems skeptical.
I mean, it's kind of like, the insofar as is like, it's insofar as like, well, given that the insofar is insofar as the things are substance, or insofar as we conceive of the things in respect to substance. But by the way, I already defined substance as everything. And if you don't follow my definitions exactly, then I think your critiques are invalid. And so, insofar as I'm right, I am right. And it's insofar as everything.
He's just not gonna stop.
Insofar as substance is everything, and everything is in relation to substance, this is true. And given that I have already given the definition that everything is substance, then insofar as that is held to be true, and insofar as you follow the rules that I put at the beginning of the book, I've got you. And I'm with that.
Nevertheless.
Right. Look, okay, no, I'm not. Yeah, that was me being kind of funny, but I think that if I was actually kind of maintain a, by the way, I'm desperately trying to like open my PS4 right now. That's why I'm like monkeying around with tools right now.
You have a PS5. Why are you messing with your PS4?
Because I want to blow it out. It's got dust.
Get compressed air.
Hey, guess what? I'm trying to pop it open. Whatever. All right. Look, thank you, Chase.
All
I'm
right.
glad you thought it was funny. But
I don't know, Hunter. It just seems like you're pulling away from Spinoza.
Yeah, insofar as we want to get back to Spinoza.
Yes. No, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not trying to pull away the attention towards my stuff. I'm saying I just was like trying to explain that I'm not pensive right now and like ruminating with dark brooding resentment. I'm looking at a screw I can't unscrew. That was the first thing. That's for my body language. The second thing is that thing I just said about insofar as, and I was trying to make a little haha. I was trying to make it funny, but I have a question that comes from that explanation that Chase that you just said, because we're talking about this. This also. I mean, I think it's possible to say certain knowledge or truth rather than absolute knowing. I just think one time in freshman year of college, I didn't get yelled at, but I got a finger wagged at me for saying the absolute in reference to Descartes in a way that Descartes does not deploy. Because they were like, if you're going to use a term and about a philosopher, you can't use it in any way other than the way that philosopher speaks, no matter what. Probably because I was stupid, and she was trying to tell me like, you're stupid. You're too stupid to do anything other than that right now. So I'm just saying we don't necessarily have to call it absolute knowing to get my rocks off, or to try and lay the cheese under the box with the string attached to the stick to lure me into Spinoza. Don't worry. But moving on. I have this question about insofar as we're considering the things in terms of their quality in terms of their attributes as substance, the distinction of attributes, and the quest for knowledge therein. To no longer pull away from Spinoza through my prefaces and my explanations and justifications. I guess when we're looking for this, and I saw something in the chat, somebody was saying like, this is going to be important later, like this conception of knowledge is going to be important later. I'm trying to interrogate that then. A part of why it comes across as if I'm like just totally incredulous sometimes is it's just confusion. Genuinely, it's like, and it's a confusion like just in the sense of acquiring knowledge with this system, it just seems so impossible, alien. It's like breathing in nitrogen and using that to fuel my blood. Like that's such a great, like there's no, I can't. Okay, no, just and then I'll try to be more specific. P10, proposition 10. This is where things really collapse. I had a lot of questions this section. I had a lot of questions. Constant, just like, what is he talking about? Who is he referencing? Who's he responding to? What is the argument? What is going on? Question mark, question mark, question. And then I was like, okay, P10, in fact, actually, P8 is where it was like the train had exploded and there were no survivors left. It was just me digging through the ashes. It started at P8, where it was like the ideas of singular things or of modes that do not exist must be comprehended the God's infinite idea in the same way as the formal essences of the singular things. There was a phrase that Chase said that made it slightly more comprehensible, which is that things, even not ideas, even non-existent ideas or ideas of things that do not exist, those have some minimal existence, given that they're ideas of things that do not exist. And the illustration that he uses is like, what if there were a million rectangles in a circle? Those are kind of crazy. And I'm not trying to be reductive for the sake of like a Jeff Foxworthy comedy bit here to try and sound like an everyman. I'm being sincere here with my reading. It was just like, let's show like an infinite circle, infinite rectangles could exist inside of a circle, and those have some sort of minimal existence. I barely comprehended that at all, or why he was mentioned. Literally after I said, why are you talking about this? I was like, why say this? Why say any of this? Who cares? Like, what does this have to do with anything else at all? And then he went on, the idea of singular things which actually exist has God for a cause, not so that I was like, okay, maybe that's a part of, sure. He's trying to paint a sort of more developed picture of these modal essences with his expressionist painting through his words. I've been thinking about that a lot as I've been reading. Is like, I'm trying to read this as if I'm looking at an expressionist painting, because I know that you said that, Chase, and I took that seriously. I know that you're not saying like it's like that, but I'm taking what you said and taking it a little farther to make it coherent for myself, or at least something. I was reading this on my break at work, so maybe that was part of the frustration. But okay. On to the interrogation of knowledge, and no more prefatory statements. P10. The being of substance does not pertain to the essence of man, or substance does not constitute the form of man. Substance does not constitute the form of man. So something isn't substance. There's a thing that isn't substance. So there's more than one thing out there that's not substance. There's substance and then something else. And that something else is the form of man. I thought that goes against everything. I feel like I'm asking like grade school interpretation questions about Spinoza, but I'm being sincere and I really want to, like, I thought the whole point was that everything is one, and that nature or God, all that you could possibly conceive, has some minimal existence, given that it's a part of this the P8, singular things or modes that do not exist must be comprehended in God's infinite idea. At least they're there in God's infinite idea. Ooh, dalali, ooh, yummy gummy. I've got an indivisible remainder here of God's infinite idea, even in my non-existent idea of fucking whatever, like lollipops and unicorns and, you know, diamond-plated Ferraris, whatever sort of fantastical thing that doesn't exist, you know, a rocket ship that can travel the speed of light. These non-existent ideas have some minimal something because it's all in there, right? It can catch anything. Next statement, actually, there's this thing that it doesn't include, and that's the form of man. The being of substance does not pertain to the essence of man, or substance does not constitute the form of man. Further, I was confused at that. Further, in demonstration, for the being of substance involves necessary existence by IP7. Therefore, if the being of substance pertained to the essence of man, then substance being given, man would necessarily be given by D2, and consequently man would exist necessarily, which by A1 is absurd QED. I went back to all of those. I've been doing that a lot, by the way. I don't know how often people do that when they read books like this, but I keep going back. Anytime a thing is, it makes it very slow and agonizing to read this. I will say that. It's slow and agonizing. There's a lot of flipping around on my pages, a lot of flipping and flapping of pages. So I went back to A1. And in fact, actually, let's just look. It said, which by A1 is absurd. According to A1, given the proof of A1, given the indefatigable, like rock solid proof provided by A1, it's absurd, right? I went back to A1. The essence of man does not involve necessary existence that is from the order of nature. It can happen equally that this or that man does exist or that he does not exist. That's just a statement. That's like setting a rule for the playground in the sandbox. That doesn't seem to me, that doesn't prove that. What if I don't agree? It's like that to me, that doesn't prove anything. And I know some philosophy is not about proof, it's about expression. La la la. This is a demonstrative series of proofs in a geometric form. I am looking for proof. And in certain texts, I'm not. I'm looking for an analysis, a description, a little look-see, maybe a fun game of words and a deconstruction even, a critique. But this one says all over, this is a proof, a demonstrative proof. And then I look at the proof and the proof says it's this way. It's the case. It is the case. And then it says, this is proven because I said so like 20 pages earlier. And the thing that's proven and again, I feel like I'm making an ass out of myself because I'm like missing some thing that is so like, I feel like that gif of that boy who's like trying to grab words with his hands and throw them into his forehead. And I'm just so lost that, you know what I mean? That's where I'm at with that one.
I don't think you're really, I think it's a part of an axiomatic system like this. We talked about this earlier and I actually voiced some kind of like similar concerns, but it's like math. Like Spinoza is building this whole system with a kind of end in mind, with this ethics in mind. And I'm not going to say like you have to read the whole thing to understand it, but it's kind of like going to the axioms of modern math and being like, I want to dispute these. It's like, okay, you can, but to what end? I guess would be his question. Now, he's building this whole project up, and I have issues with some of the axioms too. But when we get to the end, if you get to the end and you don't like the product that you wind up with, then you can start saying things like, oh, these axioms, they're where the problem is. This is where everything's going awry or whatever. But I mean, they are just axioms. They are
yes
asserted. You know?
I want to say you're completely right. And that gives me a reason to clarify something, Christian. Thank you. Like it's that I'm not trying to say, because I'm being impassioned here and like bombastic, and it's right, it's fun, but I'm not trying to say that what I'm looking at is hogwash or incoherent or inconsistent or self-contradictory. It seems as much.
Well, I can't. I need to talk to the parents first if we're going to do that.
Oh.
I need parents.
Yeah. Right.
Because I need to know who they are.
Maybe somebody someone to boss.
Someone in control of that? Whatever. Okay. Well, anyway, before we have to, whatever. My point is, I'm not trying to point to plot holes and weaknesses in the Jenga tower of the ethics and say like, ooh, there's another one. Ooh, that's kind of a boo-boo. Ooh, oh, that's kind of embarrassing. Whoa, whoopsie. I'm using my mind, my simple mind, to make sense of this stuff, to be taken along for a ride on the ferry boat of the ethics by the ferryman Spinoza, who wishes to show me his glass menagerie of ideas. And I look around and it's like I'm on like acid or something. I can't. Oh, like I think like I don't understand what I'm seeing and it's all backwards and falling into itself. And it's not necessarily a problem with the thing itself, but I'm saying that given the intent, and I'm really trying, the intentional deployment of my rationale here in following and imminently sort of criticizing, while also like I don't want to engage in taqlid. Okay, that's the thing. That's the first thing. You know, taqlid in Islamic philosophy, the uncritical acceptance of authority. I don't want to engage in taqlid at any point. At any point. Not even if it's like a quarter of the way through and it's like, hey, you got to engage in some taqlid for the next 75% of this book. Then it'll be chill. I don't want at any point. And I'm not saying that in order to Right, right. I don't want to just dogmatically accept something for the sake of its own necessity of being accepted so that the rest of a philosophical system can be coherent. And I don't necessarily want it to be such that I'm totally unconvinced of anything because it's all fucking backwards and nonsense and self-contradictory until you get to the end where you get something where it's like, oh, by the way, this kind of gives, I mean, unless I suppose you were doing something descriptive that was culminating in some sort of space of me saying, you're right. That is kind of how that is. It do be like that, though. You know, it's deductive. It is deductive. It is one statement is made, it is undeniably true. The second statement is made, it is undeniably true. The third statement is made, the first two statements guarantee the truth of the conclusion. And this one and several others, it's just crazy. And again, my point is that I'm not trying to undermine or bitch at or call out or wag my finger or criticize Spinoza for his philosophy. What I'm trying to say is that it's like one of two things is going on. And it's that I need to finish the book in order to make sense of why things are so backwards and insane and incomprehensible. And in that case, I'm not super thrilled about that, but I'll suck it up. I'm not thrilled and delighted, but I'll suck it. And we can focus on P 7 through 10 to really make this point make sense here. 7 through 10, that's where things really fucking hit the fan. It's like, if that's the case, if I need to finish it for the logic to make sense, is it about logic? It's about what it does to me. I thought, okay, Chase, maybe that's the thing. Chase, am I totally misinterpreting this? Because what I interpreted this to be is it is a logical text of proofs in a geometrical fashion in order to establish certain knowledge. That was my assumption. And maybe if I interpret this more and more and more as like a sort of Sufi poem, I will appreciate it more. But for now, you know, that, so I don't know. I'm off my wagon. Does anybody have anything to say?
I think you are the unfortunate victim of the affectations of the ideas of the ethics, and they don't seem to be agreeing with your essential relation, your modal essence, which is a kind of a speed. It's a, you know, we'll get there in the next section. But so substance isn't the form of man, or, you know, forms, you know, what are these, how do you distinguish things? So he says that things are distinguished by differences of speed and slowness. So things have a kind of rhythm to them, and things that kind of cohere with each other in terms of having the same speed that is compatible, they can build relations together. So it's a kind of Dionysian thing. And so Nietzsche says that, what is Dionysian? This is when things can work in the same rhythm together to where they form a kind of a greater body than simply are the bodies that we take as, you know, our own. Instead, he's saying that we can kind of create these larger ones by composing relations, and they're also affective relations too, in the sense that what agrees with relations, how it works in a kind of harmony between those, it would be also a kind of affect to go along with it. And if the speed of your relation does not work with something else, that will give you sad passions, and that will take away your power to do anything. So I think that does sound like that is what is occurring with the ethics. But I think if we use reason, then we can help kind of adjust your relation so that you could have some joyful affects with this. So you got to find the right speed that works with your own and also with the book, because otherwise, yeah. So I think what Spinoza is saying, in the sense that, okay, a lot of times when sad passions affect us, something happens, oh God, I've been hit by it. You know, we think of it in terms of the object, but there's also what it really is an interaction between those things. So we think of these objects in terms of, you know, how they interact with us, but really it's also our own relation that is a part of that. And the fact that they're not, if they're incompatible, that's the problem. So instead we need to think about what's the problem with that incompatibility. So I think okay.
Okay, you're helping me. I'm animated, right, but it's not out of like frustration right now. You've got me a little bit, because I'm open to that, what you're saying. I'm open. But here's the scuttle. Here's the thing. And it's that okay, all right. How about in taking Proposition 10. In Proposition 10, Scholium, they're page 37 onward. Everyone, of course, must concede that nothing can either be or be conceived without God, for all confess that God is the only cause of all things, both of the essence of their existence. That is, God is not only the cause of the coming to be of things, as they say, but also of their being. Okay. Your statement, Chase, which I believe is possibly true, and it is in fact compelling. Maybe it's because I'm woo-woo and into this sort of stuff that I kind of, you being, you know, maybe we're both kind of new agey or something, and you were able to kind of speak my lingo and kind of get me interested in like rigorous formal logic a little bit. But I'm with you. Maybe it is about this rhythm and the concurrence of passions, sad passions, and like everything you said, even though like I've finished like half this tall boy, it made complete sense. Like genuinely, it was like, or not complete sense, but made some sense that I could hook onto. There was a little bit of an attack. There's something, some friction, some sort of teeth to it. Something could grab onto. Why doesn't he say that here? Because what he says here, because this is something that Nevin and I were on last week. Nevin and I last week were really talking about the existence essence thing. The existence essence, existence. What is going on with existence and essence, right? And this, in this thing, he tackles it. The being of substance does not pertain to the essence of man, or substance does not constitute the form of man. The core of our question was, how is it that the existence of certain particular things and bodies, it is necessary but not essential. That fucked with me. Pardon my French, but that fucked with me. That was like that could turn my brain into scrambled eggs. And what you're saying makes sense, right? But then he addresses us, Nevin and I, the village idiots, the court jesters who are here to, you know, he's speaking to us. He says, hey, you people who think that it's crazy, right? In the meantime, many, that's Nevin and I, say that anything without which a thing can neither be nor be conceived pertains to the nature of the thing. Or at least maybe Nevin, you've taken off. You've managed to gain some flight and taken off. I'm still sputtering on the runway. And so he says, you would think that if it can neither be nor be conceived without a thing, then that thing would pertain to the nature of the thing. And so they believe either that the nature of God pertains to the essence of created things, or that created things can be or be conceived without God. Or what is more certain, they are not sufficiently consistent. And then he goes on this paragraph, the cause of this, I believe, it was that they did not observe the proper order of philosophizing. So it is, and then blah, 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 skip the rest of that. first fictions, they had built it basically saying you assume the primacy of like a phenomena around you and the certainty or knowledge of those things around you rather than the knowledge of the divine nature. That's the point of the paragraph, it seemed. He ends it by saying, so it is no wonder that they have generally contradicted themselves as a result of my, and it's talking to me, I'm going to say that's talking to me, as a result of my misplacement of the proper, correct order of philosophizing, which I have abandoned or failed to live up to. Because I have failed to meet the mark of proper, correct philosophizing, I have misidentified the order of thinking such that I gave primacy erroneously to things and not the divine order. And then somehow, and he never explains how, because that's not for me to know.
We're not finished yet.
Right.
We are not finished yet.
Right.
He is trying to explain it. That's what I think he's saying. He's saying there's a mereological structure that has a pattern to it that we can't really distinguish between the mind and the body, but there is a pattern. And I don't think he's making, I don't think we've gotten there yet. It's like if I just read the first 20 pages of the Phenomenology of Spirit and said, this is all bullshit.
Right.
Which it
I'm
is.
That's all it took me.
Yes,
No,
it
I'm just
is.
kidding.
Right.
An appropriate read of the text, right?
Right. I guess
Traditional grad school read.
it's just why is his response, hey, you have this problem? Your issue is that you fucked up and you're stupid. It's not your rhythm is wrong to the
I don't think he said that.
I'm apparently self-contradictory and engaging in an improper ordering of philosophizing rather than what Chase said, which is much more cogent to me, even though it's much more woo-woo, which is that the rhythm of the material as it encounters the attribute of the attribute of the material, the attribute of the idea as it encounters the mode of my thinking. The attribute of the idea as it is encountered by the modality, the modification of my thinking. The distinguishing factor between any of our thoughts and encountering this idea and its attributes is the speed. The speed not only of the two things in relation, but the speed of the relation between the two. And those variances in speed and the very variances of speed between multiple speeds of things can produce these affects. And one of those affects is a sad passion. And that sad passion can be overcome or perhaps remodeled through reason. Hallelujah. That's fine. But he doesn't say any of that. That's my thing.
I think there's a.
Go ahead, Joey.
I mean, I don't know. Like I don't understand a lot of the kind of essence form talk. I mean, I don't know if this is kind of like if this is a bad idea, but I read a lot of that as like, to me, it just kind of goes a little bit beyond me. My impression is that it again, like plugs into a lot of kind of the way people are using that language in that time. Like, again, he's like, I think he's having a lot of response to someone like Descartes, and kind of like almost just being able to kind of like plug in and show how he uses those words in a way that shows how he's different from Descartes, or just other philosophers who are kind of that mind, of that language. And I guess too, like when I'm kind of hearing Chase talk about speeds and rhythms, like, I guess to me, it's a matter of like, I see that being like, when he says like, try on this language, try on this axiom, try on this proposition, it's like, try on this rhythm, try going at this speed, and just kind of like see, what starts to make sense. And, again, I think his text is like laying this out as the foundation for more so, again, that ethical project of quote unquote, increasing our perfection, increasing our like power of acting. But I mean, I also kind of, I don't know, like Hunter refers to the text a lot, and I appreciate that. And I feel like I try to do that. I'm obviously in my car for half our seminar for this book, so I can't do that. But I feel like, yeah, there's so much parts in the text where he just absolutely loses me. And, you know, yeah, and like I read the freaking circle and the rectangles and the circles, no clue what that was saying. And I feel like those would be the areas that, you know, I would like to almost just hear what people are making from that kind of thing. Aside from, I understand Hunter's confused and mad. I'm confused and maybe optimistic and curious, willing to experiment. I feel like, I don't know if everybody else is.
What I was gonna say is,
I mean, my assumption is that everybody else is confused.
what I was gonna say is, just take back a step, and Hunter, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with anything that you said, but remember when Spinoza is writing this, what literature exists, right? If he's trying to deal with certain issues, right? He's trying to come to terms with certain issues. So he's writing this. Who is he having a conversation with? Who is he reacting against or to, right? And I mean, he's not writing in the 20th century. So I'm not expecting him, you know, to sound like Nietzsche or to sound like any 20th century philosopher, or even sound like Hegel. I mean, he is pre all of those people. So I'm trying to get a sense of him, because you know how it is. If you look at liberalism, and I mean this very broadly, you know, classical liberalism, Adam Smith, all those people, they're not reacting against Marxists. They're reacting against the mercantilists. The Marxists are the one who are reacting against the liberals, right? You can't understand Protestantism unless you understand that Protestantism is protesting Catholicism, not Buddhism. So, you know, it seems to me we have to put Spinoza back where he is, and who is he either borrowing from, who he thinks that, hey, maybe these other authors are on the right track, but they didn't go far enough, or these other writers really are going down the wrong path, and we have to just not go there because that's going to be a dead end. And you know, part of it is that he accepts God exists. No matter how Spinoza does or does not define God, some people might just stick in their craw that he's positing the existence of God. You know, not gods, you know, God singular. So I hope that made sense.
No, it did. Thank you, Ed. I have to go. I'm sorry. I have to plan a movie date for tomorrow with a parent I never met. So I'm going to go call this parent and interact with them to see if it's okay that Liam goes to the movies. I get involved the day before with things with my kids. It was like the literature seminar when he decided to tell me that his suit had a hole in it. I had to run out to the tailor. So fun. But this has been a good discussion, and I appreciate y'all. So I'm sorry, but farewell.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so we're kind of narrowing in on time a little bit, and I wanted to see if I could ask just one more kind of clerical question that's been kind of bugging me. Maybe super quick and brief, maybe leading to some more discussion. But at any point, if it seems to be that I am completely lost the plot, just jump in, interrupt me, tell me I'm dumb, whatever. It's all fine. So it seems to be the case that these things correspond in some way to thought, right? The attribute of thought, extension to thought. There seems to be some kind of correspondence there, right? And we've talked a little bit about the modes of thought. We kind of vaguely gestured to them earlier, like love and hate and things like that. Does it follow that those modes of thought could potentially, not that they exist in this moment, correspond to something in extension, like a thing?
Yeah.
Oxytocin.
Well, I don't know if Spinoza sees it that way, but
Eric, what did you say? I didn't catch it.
Oxytocin. Yeah, Spinoza wouldn't have used that word. He wouldn't have gone to the chemical molecular level, but he could have hold out a concept or a space for love, when you think lovingly, there is also a simultaneous and correlating change in the body. We now might call it oxytocin if we wanted to do simple, crude science.
No.
That the better science gives us a more sophisticated picture, but that's one way. That's one way of doing it.
See, that's interesting because when I think about like the thing, a rock, and the thought thing which corresponds to that rock, right? I'm kind of imagining in reverse, like if I was to take the thing love, the thought mode love in my head and try to correspond that to something in extension, that wouldn't be oxytocin. I would see oxytocin as oxytocin, which would correspond to its own idea and thought. I would imagine some kind of what I can only describe as like physicalization of the abstract entity of love, right? That's kind of what I'm curious if Spinoza would go down this route, or like, I'm not saying it exists. I'm saying it would be in the possible set of things that could exist in extension.
I'm stretching a little bit here, but I'm going to shift it aside. But think of the molecular shape of a caffeine. Yeah.
Mhm.
Maybe something structurally there is also energetic. You know what I mean? Like we load up our bodies with caffeine and we subjectively feel energetic, but then we also have objectively in our bodies this molecule working on neurotransmitters and things like that. So there's a change in the body, and there's a change in thought, and there's a correlation. And you can identify a molecule, but maybe it's maybe the way I'm doing it with caffeine still suggests that there's a physical causation and then like a mental epiphenomenon. I don't think we're going for that, but I'm just kind of showing a correlation, a parallelism. I'm just deny the primacy of the physical over the mental and just have them co-prime. A caffeine molecule is energeticness expressed through atoms, or whatever you want to do it. I'm not a chemist, but I'm just thinking that it's possible with tweaks.
Yeah, I think that is a good way of trying to understand it. I think that is a really good question though, and I was kind of wondering the same thing of, trying to think of exactly what is that correspondence, and so I mean I think the one he really only talks about, at least kind of so far, has been mainly the mind as the idea that is of the body. So he's saying that that correspondence is one of, at least in this regard, insofar as is our mind. I mean, obviously you can interpret that in a few ways, but let's just go with it for now. So the mind and then our body, that at least is one. So I think if we think of that as a hint, I think that does kind of give us something where, then we can think of kind of the way that there's neural correlates, as long as we don't think of those as reducing to, one attribute or mode
right
over another, and we keep them kind of corresponding. I think that is definitely a helpful way to think of it. And so I think one thing though is, so the idea that something like love, as a kind of general idea, as a mode, that kind of, maybe because I just have a kind of instinctive kind of, it seems like a Platonic idea kind of, and I think that's something that he's trying to definitely get rid of that as a kind of base, at least. If anything, I think he has an understanding of, general or abstract ideas, but I think that's gonna come later on and not be so much like a corresponding thing. So the way he's talking about this correspondence is kind of, this is the ontology that grounds epistemology, and that he's talking about these ideas and these objects as they are in either God's God's mind in the attribute of thought, or God's, nature's extended body in the attribute of extension. So where I think the more concrete stuff is going to come a little bit later, when he's going to be talking about this kind of first level of knowledge in which there's affects kind of flying around at us everywhere. And then, but I think that is really that the affect, the way that can kind of seem to cross over between, feeling. It's kind of a weird thing where it's physical kind of, but it's also kind of mental in a sense. I think that maybe will help to kind of see the correspondence of those things on that level. But that's not to say that is where the identity of the correspondence occurs. But okay, this is going on a lot of digressions. But yeah, I think the way that Eric's talking about that is helpful. Although, so Hunter read this book, apparently, the Damasio Search Looking for Spinoza, which so I know Hunter's not there right now, but how did he, what motivated him to read this book? I'm just kind of curious about that. I think Hunter's probably right that this Damasio probably does take that too far, and seeing kind of like what is it, the identity theory of like the materialist theory of mind matter, whatever, I don't know, it's an analytic thing. I can't remember what it's called, identity of functionalism or something like that. I think Spinoza would probably think that is too much of a reduction on just the material.
Well, it's funny you say that, because in my notes, one of the things I wrote was modes of thinking equal to mental states. So it's funny that you say that. Sorry.
Well, so, and that's been my impression too of that kind of that field. And again, I guess at my place of work, like I speak a lot to those ideas. And, when I was describing page 40, I think my bias comes out, and that, like, I think whether I'm guilty or I have sympathy for that idea of reducing it more so to the body, where I think, like, I'm encouraged to do that at work, almost as if this idea of like taking pressure off of the mind. Whereas I guess, Spinoza seems to, there's not necessarily a priority. And I guess I am curious too, like what shows up in that text of Damasio is like, is there a priority of the body? Which I think is a very popular idea, like in this neuroscience world of fix the body, and it kind of frees up the space for the mind to kind of just follow suit. But, I think in that world too, it's almost just like multiple directions, right? But it's interesting because it doesn't feel like Spinozan, and that they can causally influence each other, but you can come at it. It's like mutual. It's a two-way highway. And so I feel like that's, again, I've wanted to read that Damasio book for that reason, because I feel like, I kind of subscribe or have a lot of sympathy for that line of thinking. I don't know if Damasio reduces it to the body. And I know, like, in the world of, that kind of like a clinical neuroscientific perspective, there's a lot of thought about how the body can kind of free up space for us to be able to think differently, but then how the thought is also kind of like sending feedback back into the body on how it should be feeling or what's going on physically. My impression is that it's a two-way highway, and I feel like Damasio, again, that book is published in the 90s. So maybe he's, still on that kind of like response and emphasis on the body, but I think catching up, and I think Damasio's still alive. I mean, I've listened to him speak, and I feel like he's plugged into more so it being this two-way highway, not necessarily just totally reductionistic.
This is just a side rant, but what bugs me about that is that I get the impression that contemporary psychology wants to be materialist, and yet they talk about the mind and the body interacting, and I'm like, what the fuck is that? I mean, if you're a materialist, the mind is the body. I mean,
Mind
there
is
is no
metaphor.
distinction. And so, you know, when people start talking about, well, you know, that we now know that the body can affect the mind, I'm like, I thought you were a materialist. Why are you even saying these words?
Well, hey, if you're an anti-realist, then it's just a useful fiction, so that's fine. You know, who cares?
I
You can
mean,
use the term
it's-
mind as you can posit the hypothetical entity as long as it corresponds to empirical effects.
The mind is a metaphor.
It's
and
interesting.
The body. The body's a
It's
metaphor.
interesting to
Sorry,
to
go ahead.
plug Spinoza's attributes into it, and that like it's almost this just misperception of like, oh, I'm using the mind to influence the body, so you know, or vice versa, as opposed to just I get, you know, it if we're coming from that Spinoza's lens, I feel like Spinoza's saying like, well, no, like, you know, the body's changing and the mind just right there along with it. Like you just jumped on the other side of the train tracks, and for some reason that made it easier for you to kind of like change speeds, tune yourself to a new rhythm. But you know, and I you know, I feel like, I mean, that's an interesting point of it, and to me, it makes sense that maybe the mind's not changing the body's not changing the mind, but they're, you know, they're parallel, and so they're both just being changed when you change one.
Yeah, I think
It's more.
the
Go ahead, Chase.
so just to speak to what Noah was saying, I think you're definitely right in that a lot of neuroscience has what I think is probably a pretty naive conception of matter, and it's basically still a pretty Cartesian view in a lot of cases. I mean, I think some of the really or maybe more recent advanced stuff, not that I know anything about contemporary neuroscience. Oh, I read that Catherine Malibu book. There you go, right? No. But I think part of that, they're still stuck in a kind of Cartesian dualism, most of them, it seems like. And because whatever, that they're thinking in like an operational kind of perspective of that's all they need. That's the metaphysics that, you know, not that the metaphysics they presuppose in order to do their science. And it's more kind of like, okay, that's what they do. But yeah, I think that's a general problem probably with science, and that's been so kind of subordinated to industry and method that it has no room for any kind of philosophical reflection that isn't directly operational and instrumental in some way. And yeah, so the other thing is, so what Joy, what you're talking about with the kind of exploring kind of different avenues through, you know, either the body or the mind. So yeah, I think Spinoza definitely is thinking in terms of, you know, we kind of have like two powers, in that we have this power of the body to affect and be affected. We also have a power of thinking that corresponds with the mind, and we can kind of go through either outlet in order to kind of discover those aspects of the corresponding attribute. So I can, the same way, kind of explore my body. That sounds kind of sexual. Okay, sorry.
Ooh.
Yeah, I could explore my body's
AC on.
powers, you know, in order to discover also a power of thinking. And the same way I can explore a power of thinking that unlocks some powers of my body. And I think thinking really, there's an aspect of science that I think definitely kind of deals with something like that, or at least hints towards that. The fact that, yeah, if I could understand, you know, maybe something about neuroscience, or I can even understand, you know, something on a more kind of like intuitive or phenomenological level of, you know, awareness of something about my body or my thinking patterns or habits of whatever, that I can maybe then use that as a kind of comparison to discover those powers of thought that correspond with it. And he's kind of, so by using this doctrine, he'd be saying, you can almost do it as an exercise of, okay, there's this thing going on with my body. What kind of corresponds with that in terms of my thinking? So it forces you to then kind of try to see, where are these kind of connections going? So one thing, I put this in the chat, but I think this is quite an interesting thing that Spinoza is making, in that so consciousness is different from thinking. So he has this idea definitely of unconscious thought, because consciousness is an idea of an idea, but don't worry, we'll get there eventually, actually pretty soon, I think. And so I think, though, that is interesting, because that unconscious thought gives you a better chance then to have that kind of exploration of the powers of thinking through the body, because a lot of ways you can see the body as kind of connected with this unconscious of thought, although just don't of course don't reduce them to say like, oh, that's what it is. But yeah, I think we've gotten to that. We understand that by now.
I was gonna say that it reminds me of Merleau-Ponty and kind of him talking about, the capacities of our body. I mean, I just kind of remember this theme that my impression of one of the themes, I don't remember, but where it's exactly from. But again, we read that phenomenology of perception, and I remember just hanging out with that idea that like the capacities of our body, like the capabilities, are kind of just, that kind of feeds into how we look around and perceive space. And this idea of like, I see people talk about like physical disabilities now, kind of being plugged into that kind of phenomenological perspective, and just this idea that, becoming physically disabled, it's like the whole world is like shifted. You perceive things differently. And I mean, is it a jump to say that that's also kind of manifesting in the way we think, like what kind of thoughts we have, what kind of directions our thoughts go in. And that again, what I'm doing with my body, what has become a pattern in the body. So not necessarily just all the things I could do, but like, what are the things I usually do? And how those kind of, become just also patterns of thinking and perceiving the world. Patterns of like thoughts relating to other thoughts in the same way that like the body relates to the world, kind of based on what it can do or what it's used to doing, what it's been reinforced to do. And then you see people, and I feel like this is a pretty pop psychology idea, but there's at least, clinical or psychological scientific research to support it. But the idea is around like quote unquote power posing. But, you kind of like going further than power posing, someone like Willem Reich looking at just how we're holding our bodies and how this might be storing or this might chronic tension in the body also kind of manifests as particular like psychological symptoms, and that like relieving either or can kind of relieve the corresponding one almost seemingly spontaneously. And you have a lot of people doing body work of that sort, people studying trauma and looking at like the effects trauma has on the body, and the idea that the body typically being left out of the picture results in everybody just trying to like do stuff with the mind, but not really being able to. And I think that's where almost you can see neuroscience maybe prioritizing the body, where the body needs to be handled first, and then that creates the space for the mind to change. But I think just to reinforce that idea, you see a lot of that in that kind of clinical field of let's change what's going on with your body instead of trying to like exclusively focus on think different thoughts, almost as a way of kind of just coming in the back door.
Well, the body has a lot of muscle memory. And I think that there's just more and more. My sister was talking to me about one type of psychological therapy that actually deals with music and sound, and certain levels there. And literally, she said that she actually used it, and that she literally thought it was kind of stupid when she first heard about it, but she investigated it, and that by having a certain tone or pitch of notes, she literally felt herself letting go. I'm putting it in my words what she said, so I apologize to her, she's not here, but kind of like letting go psychological of the negative memory she had of past incidents. And she didn't realize how much, in her words, that those memories were part of her current psychological state. And that by having those tones, she literally felt herself kind of like psychologically relaxing, which obviously was having an effect on her body. So I mean, for me, I it's not one or the other, and if we don't use the word mind, I'm fine with that. But brain, and when you think of the processes of the brain, some of them are chemical, some are electromagnetic. And so for me, I think I really am uncomfortable when there's a dualism and a separation, because I think that it's impossible to separate them and they're constantly interacting with each other.
And I think maybe that was a question I had. I think Christian had said it earlier, but I don't remember the exact words he used, but something like thought or mind is a mental state. And, we were kind of like saying that you said it in a way that was just like, that can't be the case. And when
Modes of
Ed
thinking
says that
as a mental state. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when Ed says that of like using the word brain, and I almost hear that in like Nevitt's point about like, is psychology materialist? They claim to be materialist, but then they talk about the mind interacting with the body. Like if we replace that with brain, and like how would that plug into Spinoza's system when he uses the word thought? Like to what extent might we plug in like something happening in the brain?
Well, I mean, again, I could be completely wrong, but one thing I like about Spinoza is that they seem to have equal priority, ontological priority. I mean, neither one of them have ultimate priority because, God has ultimate priority, but insofar as thought and extension are both attributes, they seem to have equal ontological priority. Whereas, like in something like epiphenomenalism or something of that sort, matter, any sort of materialist philosophy, matter always has the priority. And whatever mind is, it's kind of derivative or an interpretation or, something sort of secondary to matter. But for Spinoza, they have equal priority.
But I have a question. Would any of this sound, I don't know, this kind of reminds me of Dewey's How We Think, where it's just, you know what I mean? Like thought is just simply like a habit of activity. Like it's just like that's like, he just kind of like attempts to deflate the good old pragmatist move, just deflate the hell out of the conversation. And I kind of think that's what, to some extent, Spinoza's also trying to do. He's trying to take some of the air out of the scholastics. And so there could just be a similar thing to go on here to say is that like, we don't have to be, I don't know, traditional analytic philosophers and do the song and dance of the epiphenomenal states or, stuff riding upon the top of your brain like it's some waves and the surfers on it. Or like reifying, some stuff some more. Just get really, really deflationary and just say, something really, really like flat, almost axiomatic about the brain. So I don't know. That's like maybe that's what's going on here. Is that like Spinoza's just like taking some air out of the scholastics here?
Yeah, and I guess I'm wondering, what does that deflate? Like, what kind of power do we lose? How are we flattening the mind by kind of doing that? If Spinoza's doing that, like, are we missing something?
Yeah, so I think so. The way he talks about, you know, affections and whatnot, he uses a kind of, well, so I was reading Beth Lord's Spinoza's Ethics, which is an excellent guidebook that has taught me a lot, and I highly recommend it. And one thing, so she mentions Merleau-Ponty, and also specifically that idea that, you know, so Merleau-Ponty said this in reacting to Descartes also, and that I'm not an I am, but a I can capacity. And I think that's definitely what he's doing. And also the other thing is Beth Lord also talks about disabilities and also that correspondence, because then is he saying, you know, kind of like it's about increasing power in one regard, and then, you know, it works in the other. But then does that mean that, you know, somebody who's physically disabled can't think, has like a lesser ability to think? And she kind of goes through and shows that that's indeed not the case. And it's really much more complex than that, and shows some, probably in a much better way than definitely I've been able to describe it, kind of how those two would correspond, so that indeed something like a physical or mental disability doesn't automatically mean just like this total general, you know, disability in the other regard, the other side. So yeah, I definitely recommend that book.
I mean, I don't think when we think physical disability, like we use the word disability like they just lost abilities, but, you know, it's just like you might say it's a different way of operating. And I guess, does Beth Lord go as far as to say that that's not going to change the way they think at all? Or just like, you know, I think to say a physical disability is kind of plugging it into what we consider to be abled. I'm wondering, again, we might use that same logic when we just think about how is a person thinking differently if they're physically disabled. It doesn't necessarily mean they're like disabled from thinking. They can't think, but, you know, it's like, I think they might be thinking differently.
Yeah, I think that's what she says. She kind of challenges this idea that indeed, yeah, that's how, you know, there's a disability studies which definitely critiques the language of disability, that it is something, you know, just inherently like a value-laden term. And I think she's kind of doing something like that by saying that, okay, this something that we think of, you know, as something like a physical or mental disability can also be a way of having an ability that's different. It shows how that can work. So something like I'm in a wheelchair. I have something like that. I then have a different way of relating to kind of how I think of motion, how I actually do move. And with that, I think there is some increased powers that you can have, both, you know, in terms of thinking and also in terms of capacities of your body for certain things. And, you know, there's almost kind of like a cybernetic element to this, in the sense that, you know, what is something like a wheelchair or whatever, you know, it's kind of like technology as prosthesis, you know, it's an extension of your body in some regard. And I think something like that can also kind of factor in here. And that's also where he's going to kind of get into this relation to our larger environment, and how it's kind of these affective relations that really kind of show, you know, the vectors of our power, whether we have sad passions and our powers being lowered or the opposite. So yeah, I think next time we'll have he goes into this kind of
Logging off on the Tai Chi. Bye-bye. Good talks.
Yeah, it's definitely 8:08. Okay, yeah. Yep.
No, please continue what you're saying.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say for next time, so goes a little more into the kind of like parallelism thing about how it's basically how the mind is the idea of the body, but then he's going to say, well, that means in order to understand the mind, which is kind of like the goal of the chapter, we first have to understand the body. So he goes on this kind of section that's relatively famous for describing the body in an interesting way that I find, at least this I find it interesting. But then he'll go on to talk about how that goes into this larger kind of epistemology where, okay, now suddenly we have to think about, he's got all this stuff about imagination, about affects, about memory, all this stuff. And yeah, so just wanted to give a kind of, I don't know, preview, but also that Beth Lord book is really, really helpful. I strongly recommend it.
Did you put a link to that in the Discord?
Yeah, I posted it a while ago, but it got like probably just stuck in a bunch of other stuff, so I can definitely repost it. Yeah.
Chase, can I steal you for 5 minutes of rapid fire question? Just 2 questions. I just didn't get a chance to get them in this time. It shouldn't take too long.
Hey, peace out.
Peace.
It's been nice to meet you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so the first one, this is kind of going back to where we were a while ago. I didn't have a chance to get it in when it was like relevant, so I didn't want to like drag it all up again. But it's talking about the relationship between thoughts and things, or thought and extension, rather, if you'd like to word it that way. And I just kind of tossed something out there on a comment that Nevid had put out, where I was thinking like, okay, so we have these 2 different ways of kind of talking about the same thing. Could we kind of view this as like the words blue and azul corresponding to the same, like having the same meaning per se? They are the same thing, but they are not literally the same thing. They are different on like a fundamental level, but they still get the same idea across.
Oh,
because
yes,
I'm just to kind of just to show you where my headspace is at. Like I can buy the fact that Spinoza's like, these are 2 different perspectives, but it's kind of like there's on one hand, he's presenting these things as meaningfully distinct ideas, extension and thought. And on the other hand, he says there are 2 perspectives of viewing the same thing. And I'm having a really hard time kind of squaring that circle,
Oh, so I'm thinking of, so in the, I hate to bring up the Deleuze book on Spinoza, the big one, he goes into some stuff about kind of the like theory of language, theory of sense, and how that relates to how he thinks all these relations of expression go. I wonder if that would be helpful or not, but I think, okay, so I think I might be misunderstanding kind of what your point, but I think if your point is something like say if like blue, and there's something like a blue thing, like my shirt is kind of blue, would the corresponding mode of thought be something like the sense of blue?
Kind of. I guess the point that like they're supposed to be the same thing, but they're not. They're extension and thought, right? So that's what I'm having the hard time with. Is it's like, okay, they're the same thing, but they're not. They're extension and thought. So I'm really just trying to make sure I have this relationship rock solid, because it's something that as I continue to read on, it's like a buzzing in the back of my head. Like I don't feel like I really understand how this works, but
I was trying to come up with a physical analogy again. I've been unable to do that, but what I was thinking of, when I was we were chatting on the side with Joey, is you've got this substance, God, and God, whatever God does, whatever it is that God generates, operates according to these necessary laws, or I don't know if law is the right word, but these, whatever actions this thing generates, acts according to these necessary laws through these infinite number of attributes, which means every attribute is going to express the same necessity, the same set of necessary events, not the right word, but so therefore, when you have this expression of extension and this expression of thought, they necessarily are going to track, as are, I assume, all the other attributes that we don't have access to, because they're all clocking out in this form of necessity. So, I don't, they're both the same, they're expressions of the same substance according to the same necessary laws, and they generate different attributes, but these attributes are going to clock out they're going to sequence out in the same exact way. That doesn't explain really their ontological relationship, but maybe explains the parallelism.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you can use the word laws for Spinoza, at least. Yeah, it's still, I think, difficult without getting examples. I think that's the thing that kind of can give you a more intuitive sense. And then sometimes you have to kind of think in conjunction with that, which I realize is not a but I can't think of the word. Deductive. It's not a deductive way of thinking or whatever, but yeah. So I think that role I think is also overplayed. I think that's part of it, but yeah. So the way that I think it's really okay, but Chris, what you were saying about the kind of the way that, they're the same thing, but they're also in another sense distinct. I think that is definitely right. And it definitely, I think you're right to think that is paradoxical. Because I think on another level it is. But that's where you've got these kind of key distinctions. But what are the distinctions of? There are different types of distinctions. Because, once again, it's that, I know we already turned it into basically a meme, but insofar as, because they're the same insofar as they refer to, the single numerical substance. They're distinct insofar as they refer to the different essences expressed, or the different attributes, really. That's what is different. But they all express a power of God, substance, nature thing. And
this is not a great analogy, because it's not perfect, but I mean it's partially a false analogy, but maybe something similar. I'm thinking if you have an electron, used to be electrical engineer, but if you have an electron generates an electric field because it's a negative charge. But if you take that electron and you move it, that generates a magnetic field. So a moving electron has an electric field and it generates a magnetic field. And so as a result, the magnetic field and the electric field they're both manifestations of this same entity. And they mathematically, Maxwell figured out you can describe that relationship very precisely mathematically. But an electric field and a magnetic field are two different kinds of fields. They interact with different kinds of things, but they're both generated by the same entity. So I don't know. I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but something similar maybe.
Well, I think Sorry, good.
Can I use another analogy? And I don't know if this is so great, but when you said it, Nevin, I was thinking of the old physics. Is light a wave or particles? And if you test light with some experiments, you get waves.
Yeah.
And when you test it with other experiences, like there you get the particles.
Yeah, the double slit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've heard
Louis
people
Broglie and Max
talk
Planck.
about
How do you
Spinoza
explain
and make that comparison, the wave particle
Yeah.
duality. Yeah.
If you ask it a particle question, it'll give you a particle answer. If you ask it a wave question, it'll give you a wave answer.
and they're both correct, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Which I don't. My son and I have a disagreement about this. He thinks there's a way to intelligibly bring those two together where you can make sense. To me, it seems to me that what it really shows is we just don't understand what the hell's going on.
Bingo.
and maybe that's the same thing with Spinoza. Like when Chase was saying it's paradoxical, you can say, well, light is a particle and it's a wave, and we're like, what? That makes no sense. And so maybe something similar with Spinoza.
More aptly, it's not so much as paradoxical as it is a contradiction, right? Like just a blatant contradiction.
No, so I think you definitely have to make those distinct. Because I think, yeah, contradiction is something that's basically just false because it doesn't jive with each other. That would be kind
Law of the excluded middle, man.
I take it as insofar as on the same level, or usually the principle of contradiction kind of thing is usually different things attributed at the same time. It'd be kind of like something like that, where I think exactly what he wants to do is kind of instead show that they're operating in different senses, and they're
right,
insofar as that.
To clarify, I'm not saying Spinoza is like bold-face accepting a contradiction, just that the mental picture in my head was one that was necessarily contradictory, which is how I knew there was an issue.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. I should have worded that better. If you have just another 2 minutes, I wanted to just ask you one more thing. So I, after having read this section and being revealed of the two of the infinite attributes that we have awareness of, it completely destroyed my attribute property correlation that I was building up to, right? But now I'm whether I'm just trying to save this for the sake of me really wanting to compare these things to properties or what, is it the case that that not only are there infinitely many properties, but would it be fair to say that thought and extension themselves are infinitely divisible? Because that would seem to me to make more sense for Spinoza's original, we need infinite attributes to explain all of the crazy new things that we find in the world all the time, or in the universe, whatever. That seems to jive more with that thinking that thought and extension are infinitely divisible than that there necessarily is an infinite number of attributes that we can make no sense of.
Yeah, so he kind of says both, and that, so what kind of like what Nev was talking about as this kind of order of operations, I guess we can call it, where you start with substance as this kind of, churning power within itself. It first expresses itself in infinite attributes, and we'll just go along with that for now. And then each of those attributes in turn expresses itself in an infinite number of modes. So if you think of that as kind of divisibility, then I think that is right in how he sees, one way you can think of it is when he talks about something as infinite, like absolutely infinite, the way that the absolute infinite is expressed in the attribute will also have a kind of infinite for its kind, and that will correspond with like this infinite aspect of the quality, in the same way that he thinks we can kind of comprehend something like in itself just from the perspective of extension, or just from the perspective of mind, and that there's a kind of there's an infinity kind of that is characteristic of that. And then there's an aspect of attributes insofar as they're also kind of this active power, and they're expressing substances power that then leads to a numerical infinity, which is going to be all the modes. And these are all governed by a kind of necessity. So I think, yeah, so it's definitely, I think, so there's a lot of debate about the nature of the attributes in Spinoza scholarship.
Yeah, I saw some people take the infinite to be like, not really that there's infinite attributes, but that in totality, that's like the totality of attributes. You know, there's all sorts of interpretations apparently.
Yeah. So, okay, this is somewhat beside the point, but I just thought it was interesting that I looked this up. I'd heard that somebody did some kind of a formal logic kind of version of the ethics, and they did for only a small part of part one, but still it was kind of interesting to look at it. It's in modal logic, if you know that, S5, which is, that's happened to be the kind that I briefly learned, which is what is now a while ago, since I've been in goddamn graduate school for so long, or it seems like it. And so that was interesting. So if you know anything about modal logic, I think that would possibly be interesting to look at it. But yeah, the attributes. So one of the things is, do we see them as, there's what's called the subjectivist perspective that sees them as illusory, in a sense that there's kind of like something posited by the mind, but ultimately, so that distinction is not a real distinction between the attributes. It's kind of an illusory distinction. And this is famously, Hegel has, is it really a secret or a surprise? A subjectivist interpretation of Spinoza. Of course, because everything is subjective, and, or is that a contradiction? You know, oh, well, that's good. Yeah. It's the dialectic in action, right? Where there's also what is usually called like an objectivist, I think, perspective that sees them. Actually, that might be wrong. Maybe it's not called objectivist. Maybe I'm thinking too much in a binary sense there, but they see the attributes as objectively distinct, which I think that makes sense. You just have to think of the distinctions in a very specific way.
Yeah. Was that paper you were talking about by Charles Jarrett by any chance?
Yeah, I think that's
okay.
Right.
Awesome. I got it right here. Thank you for answering all my questions. One last thing, just for all the people who've been saying finish reading it, these last 41 pages better be pretty freaking enlightening, is all I'm saying. Because I just started reading ahead, and I've been reviewing before on the sections that we're at. I'm at 140, and it's still not making, I'm still struggling here, but we'll see. So
yeah, it's dense material. So one thing that I was thinking, so I was reading that Beth Lord book, and so she's also a scholar of Deleuze and Kant, and a pretty respected one for, and Spinoza, of course. So all three. And in there, she says quite bluntly, like, this is one of the hardest books you'll ever read. And I was like, and then I'm starting to see it going really in detail. I think like, yeah, this is, I mean, it took him, he was writing it for, I can't remember, it was something ridiculous when he first started writing. It was like 15 years or something, and he was only like 40 when he died. So he was like painstakingly working on this. I think you'd see why. And it's not, it is kind of like the method, definitely, that's difficult, but there's also just kind of like the way that all this thinking like fits together, and how that it links all this different stuff, that it's not just kind of like a purely logical ontology or something like that. It goes into ethics and politics and stuff. And
I respect the hell out of writing a book on ethics that goes into metaphysics and theory of mind. Like, I think this is stuff that too much of contemporary ethics just kind of blows off. But that's, that's a me thing. So I at least appreciate the comprehensiveness of his theory. Like from ground up, he's building this. And hey, whatever you say about it in the end, that's an achievement.
Yeah, definitely. I think if anything, he deserves quite a bit of respect for this. And yeah, I like that comprehensiveness too. Definitely the kind of it has its role at times, but definitely the hyper specialization I think that philosophy is taken on, especially from pressure from the sciences and the way that institutional departments have to be organized this way, that philosophy has become organized based on this kind of external factor that you have to hyper specialize in order to become a scholar. I have to hyper specialize in this hyper specialization, the hyper specialization, and that's kind of like just happens to be now this form that academic philosophy is taking. And you definitely see that. Yeah, so with ethics, it's definitely true. And I think something like going back and looking at something like Spinoza's ethics, that shows like, okay, there's a different way of doing this. And it's definitely, so I think it really goes back to the way that we used to think of philosophy, that it's a way of living, it's a style of life. And I think that's kind of really what he's getting into, is this is something you live the ethics. You don't just simply kind of like think about it and kind of like give like counterexamples or whatnot, that there's a place for that too. But it's really kind of a thing you do with all of your powers and faculties, I guess.
Yeah, there was a quote from somebody. It's not Russell. I keep wanting to say it's Russell, but it's like, there is no ethics without metaethics. There is no metaethics without metaphysics and epistemology. And there is no metaphysics and epistemology without a love of learning all things. And I think, that's like an interesting way of like viewing philosophies as like giant umbrella of ideas that I really like, but sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Bertrand Russell is kind of like Ronald Reagan, and that he has great quotes, but I disagree with almost everything he really says when it comes down to it.
Hey, watch your mouth. That's one of my favorite writers. I disagree with a lot of his stuff too, but yeah, I mean, I'm super influential writer on me at least. Amazing.
Also, apparently a pretty great guy.
Apparently, yeah. I mean,
yeah. He was friends with Whitehead, and he called him something like Bernie or something. No, it was something even more informal than that. He had like a pet name for Bertrand Russell's, like something like that. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with Alfred North Whitehead. We read him in a seminar. That was a while back. That was like 4 years ago. I don't even know how long I've been doing it.
God, amazing. Yeah, Principia Mathematica, right? Yeah. Okay. Any more questions for the explainer?
I think I can save the rest of the stuff for when we get to the next part of the reading. Oh, plenty of questions. Don't get me wrong.
Well, I appreciate your questions, Christian. They're always really, really excellent questions. So
yeah, I agree.
I feel like I'm just trying to like make sure I've got the foundations right, honestly, because I don't know. That's what's giving me the most trouble at the moment. But
well, those are great questions, very important ones. So thank you. Okay.
Everybody.
Go take a nap now.
Oh yeah.
Please be safe with the weather.
You too. Bye-bye.